It all started on an archipelago of 4 islands called Yaka Island. 3 of them were inhabited by humans, while the 4th was inhabited by 2 elemental dragons of fire and water. These dragons were the protectors of the islands. Here, the legend tells us that the water dragon weakened, causing the laic energy, which was a source of energy responsible for the entire Earth, to be interrupted and lose its balance. This caused the fire dragon to go crazy and attack the humans, so a powerful sorcerer sacrificed his life to restore the powers of the water dragon and fuse with the fire dragon, restoring the balance to the Earth. Sometime later, we meet our protagonist, Shukido, a boy who lived on the 2nd island of Aka with his father Makoto and his father's student Shinshi. Our protagonist and Shinshi were very close, but at one point our protagonist activated his powers without realizing it, causing both of them to be surrounded by water, making Shinshi afraid. Makoto intervenes and uses an ability to nullify the protagonist's powers. There, Makoto asks Shinshi to keep this a secret from the whole family, including his other students, Haruaki and Ake. So Makoto reveals to Shinshi that our protagonist is the water dragon god. As time passed, Shinshi asked Makoto if our protagonist would ever take the form of a dragon again, and Makoto responded that when our protagonist grew up, he would be able to switch between his human form and that of a dragon. But for that he would have to perform a complicated ritual. In the end, Makoto tells Shinshi not to worry, that he has to take care of our protagonist until the time comes to perform the ritual. We see how Haruaki and Ake, as Makoto's students, trained and exterminated some malignant monsters called Aratama. The 3 students aspired to become laic masters like Makoto, basically wanting to become sorcerers of laic energy. The students and their master were very close, along with the island's mayor, Sanji, and this girl named Momoko, so they all lived happily as if they were a family. Later, while Haruaki and Ake were training, Shinshi appeared and told them to take it easy with the training. But Haruaki responded that he wanted to become Makoto's successor when he retired from the sanctuary where he worked, so he had to train more to become more powerful. Ake asked Shinshi why he didn't train, and he responded, "Do you see me looking like I want to train? Look at how broken I am. I have the powers of a water dragon. Explain to me what more I want in life. The only thing I want is to watch a summary of Tin every day because he's a god." But Makoto kicked Shinshi to make him start training. Ake took the opportunity to ask Makoto to let them participate in the ritual of pacifying the dragon, basically calming the fire dragon. But Makoto told them they weren't ready, but that in the future, the 3 students might be able to perform the pacification of the dragon on their own. Shinshi says he's tired of this ritual since it has to be done every year at the volcano where the dragons live. So Makoto explains that he has to do it because the water dragon is missing. And this makes the fire dragon feel so alone that it wants to destroy everything. But what worries Makoto the most is that the dragon is turning into an Aratama. Haruaki, upon hearing this, asks if that's the reason why they have to strengthen the barrier that contains the dragon on the 4th island. And Makoto responds yes. But Aka is worried since the power of the fire dragon increases more and more with each passing year. Time passes, and we see Makoto's students continue training and exterminating Aratamas, while they all live together happily with our protagonist. But one night an earthquake occurs that is felt on the other islands because the fire dragon is about to break free from its seal. Makoto tells his students to help evacuate the civilians while he goes to find a weapon to pacify the dragon alone. But when Haruaki and Aka see how the earthquake scares the Aratamas, which are aquatic creatures that reflect harmony, they decide to go to the 4th island to pacify the dragon. Once both students arrive on the island, they try with all their power to prevent the dragon from coming out of the volcano. But the barrier containing the dragon's powers breaks, causing both students to expend their energy and the dragon to be released. While this was happening, Shinshi takes our protagonist to evacuate. But our protagonist, being so young, doesn't understand anything that's happening. Back with Haruaki and Aka, They try to contain the fire dragon, but it attacks Aka and Haruaki barely saves him. When the fire dragon was about to eliminate both boys, Makoto arrives just in time and saves them. He tells his students to leave and let him handle this. Aka wants to stay and help his master, but Haruaki, realizing that they would only be in the way, decides to forcibly take Aka away. Makoto realizes how serious the situation is and that the lives of the inhabitants of the Aka Islands depend on him. So he sacrifices himself to fight and reseal the dragon. While from a distance it looks as if the volcano is erupting from their battle. Once everything calmed down, both students return to the volcano to look for their master. But they find Makoto dead with a smile on his face, leaving both students in shock. On the day of Makoto's funeral, Sanji speaks with Momoko about Makoto's will. As it turns out that it says to take our protagonist away from the island, and for everyone to cut off all contact and relationship with him until he turns 15. No one understands why they would have to leave our protagonist alone at such a moment. But Shinji asks them to trust their master and fulfill his last wish. In the end, our protagonist leaves the islands to Shaka, and Shinji is sure that his master's last will has to do with our protagonist being the water dragon. So he secretly looks for his master's book with the instructions for the special ritual that had to be performed on our protagonist to turn him into the water dragon, since now he is the only one who can perform said ritual. But Shinji learns that Makoto planned to sacrifice his life to restore our protagonist's powers, just as the legend at the beginning said. In the end, Shinji decides to be the one to sacrifice himself to fulfill that ritual when our protagonist grows up and returns to the island. So Shinji, knowing he doesn't have much time left to live, enjoys living life to the fullest. 10 years later, Shinji overhears Sansi talking to Momoko about going to get our protagonist and bring him back home. So Shinji offers to go find him. On the other hand, we see that our protagonist grew up in an orphanage and received a letter from Sanji asking him to return to the Ayaka Islands. Our protagonist goes to sleep, and that same night he dreams he is underwater. But our protagonist is no longer surprised because he dreams about it quite often, and even prefers to be there than in the real world. But a hand pulls him out of the water, causing our protagonist to wake up and release some of his power for a few seconds. The next day, our protagonist graduates from school and decides to return to the Ake Islands, but at the exit he meets Shinji, who was drinking beers. Our protagonist does not recognize Shinji and tries to ignore him, but the green-haired man starts to follow him outside the school. At one point, Shinji pushes our protagonist off a bridge, making him fall into the water. Our protagonist starts to sink in the water, and when it seems he is about to drown, his powers are activated, causing him to start losing control. Shinji, seeing this, uses the spell to calm the water and then uses another to literally take our protagonist away in a backpack. When our protagonist regains consciousness, he realizes he is traveling on a ship with Shinji, and our protagonist tells him, "Dude, where did you take me? They told me to watch out for white vans, but they never told me about magical white backpacks." So Shinji explains to our protagonist that he went to find him, and that now he's going to the Eke Islands. Our protagonist realizes that Shinji also grew up on those islands, but he still doesn't remember him since they were separated for many years. So Shinji introduces himself and explains to our protagonist that they were quite close when they were younger. Once they both arrive at the second Yaka Island, they are received by Sanji and Makoto. Our protagonist doesn't recognize them either, but they tell him to relax, and they all go together to see the house where they live. Once there, our protagonist sees a photo of himself with his father and the rest of the family, but our protagonist doesn't remember anyone. Those present tell our protagonist the kind of person his father was, and that he was a laic master who protected the island. When our protagonist asks about his mother, Sanji and Momo respond that they have no idea. One day Makoto just showed up with our protagonist. Sanji apologizes to our protagonist for leaving him all these years and explains that it was his father's last wish. The mayor offers for him to live with them from now on, and our protagonist accepts since all that is in the past. When our protagonist goes to his room, Shinji follows him and asks him why he now seems colder than when he was younger. Our protagonist tells him that one day when he was a kid, he was in a river with other kids. One of them started making fun of him, calling him an orphan, and our protagonist got so angry that he unintentionally released his water powers and almost drowned the kid who was bullying him. This happened several times and caused our protagonist to distance himself from people to keep his emotions under control, and thus avoid hurting anyone else. But when our protagonist finishes speaking, it turns out Shinji wasn't paying attention. So our protagonist gets angry and goes for a walk alone at night. On the way, he encounters an aratama that seems to be in pain and falls into the river. But coming out of the river is the aratama turned into a monster that tries to attack our protagonist. But just then Shinji arrives and rescues our protagonist. Here, Shinji explains to our protagonist that what he saw is a corrupted aratama by negative emotions. Our protagonist feels guilty because he had negative emotions at that moment. But Shinji tells him to relax and watch. Shinji uses his spells and easily destroys the aratama's body. But when it regenerates, Shinji pushes our protagonist, causing him to enter the aratama's body. Our protagonist gets so upset that he activates his powers, causing the aratama to explode. But our protagonist's water powers try to attack Shinji. So the green-haired man uses his techniques to nullify the attacks with ease. Our protagonist is surprised by Shinji's abilities, but also reveals that he is scared of having attacked him unintentionally. Here, Shinji tells our protagonist not to be afraid of his powers, as his problem is that he cannot control them. So Shinji motivates our protagonist to train and promises to help him control his powers. The defeated aratama is purified and becomes laic energy, which we remember is responsible for basically everything, like life itself. The next day, our protagonist begins training with Shinji. But our protagonist doesn't understand how he's going to control his powers if he's simply sitting and meditating. Shinji explains that he will help him, but that for now he should concentrate on feeling the laic energy. Our protagonist asks what laic energy is, and Shinji explains that it is the vital energy that flows deeply in the earth, but that most of that energy is under the island, and the laic masters use this energy to keep everything under control. So our protagonist has to learn to use this energy to control his own water power. After that, Shinji receives an order to finish off an aratama that appeared out of nowhere. The green-haired man believes he can help our protagonist with his training, so he takes him along to complete the task. When they both arrive with the aratama, the monster only attacks Shinji, so he spends the time running and asking our protagonist to attack the aratama. Our protagonist concentrates some of his power and strikes the monster, but both boys cannot defeat the aratama. So out of nowhere Haruaki appears and, using a wind technique, defeats and purifies the aratama. Our protagonist thanks Haruaki for the help, and he is so shocked to see our protagonist that he grabs him and lifts him up like a baby. Since our protagonist doesn't remember him either, Haruaki introduces himself and reveals that he was also a student of Makoto's. Later, Haruaki takes our protagonist to his house, and the three of them, along with Momoko, sit down to dinner. Our protagonist congratulates Haruaki on how he defeated the aratama earlier, and Haruaki tells him that laic mastery is about purifying the aratamas and maintaining the balance between the islands, since these beings are not enemies because they do not intentionally become corrupted and only seek to coexist. The next day, the three of them, Shinji, go to the first Aka island, which turns out to be much more developed than the other islands. When they arrive, at one point the two separate, so our protagonist explores the area until he comes across a clown who was doing tricks in public on top of a ball. But after a while the clown's ball starts to float in the air and turns into an aratama. Our protagonist realizes the danger and saves the clown from being attacked by the aratama, while the rest of the people flee the scene. Our protagonist, being alone, realizes that he is the only one who can defeat the aratama and protect the civilians. But then a guy with a gun appears and easily defeats the aratama. This guy turns out to be Ake, and when he sees our protagonist, he recognizes him immediately and is happy to reunite with him. They walk together, and as they talk about the past, Ake introduces himself as one of our protagonist's father's students. As expected, our protagonist doesn't recognize him either, and is struck by the fact that Ake purifies aratamas using a gun, since he didn't know there were different ways to do such work. After a while, Ake invites our protagonist to his building where he has a business, and when they both enter, it turns out Shinshi was working there as a bartender, so our protagonist tells him, "Ah, so you left me alone to come work here." Once things calmed down, our protagonist asks Ake why the aratama that Haruaki purified here seemed to leave peacefully, while the one Ake purified seemed to leave in an aggressive and painful manner. Ake reveals that he did not purify the aratama, but rather exterminated it, since he does not purify the aratamas because they harm people. Our protagonist admonishes this from Ake, since at least Haruaki purifies these monsters so they can leave in peace. But Ake says he doesn't care about the aratamas in comparison to human lives, since he prefers to save humans rather than save monsters by giving them the opportunity to return to the lake energy. Basically, Haruaki faithfully follows Makoto's teachings and purifies the monsters, while Ake prefers to shoot them to kill them. After a while, a girl named Iwara arrives and tells Ake that they found the main body of the aratama from before. Our protagonist is confused since he saw Ake shoot it. So Ake explains to our protagonist that the aratama did not have the characteristic eye that all monsters have, which means its main body was somewhere else. Ake tells Shinshi to take our protagonist to his house, while the handsome redhead goes to look for the monster. As Shinshi and our protagonist are leaving, he asks Shinshi what kind of business Ake has, and Shinshi responds that it is a security company that is actually in charge of exterminating aratamas to protect the citizens and tourists of the island. Our protagonist doesn't like Ake's methods, but Shinshi tells him he's doing a good job since with the increase in tourism on the islands, aratama sightings have also increased due to the energy that tourists bring to the islands, and unwittingly they interrupt the harmonious energy of the islands. So Shinshi recommends that our protagonist not judge the aratamas by human standards, since they do not sympathize with humans. Our protagonist asks Shinshi what Haruaki thinks of Ake's methods, and Shinshi responds that he doesn't like them and warns our protagonist not to talk about that with Haruaki since they are at odds. Shinshi doesn't want to give our protagonist any more details and leaves, saying he forgot to get paid for the day. Our protagonist, left alone, heads home, but he feels tremors and growls in the area. Our protagonist approaches the area where these tremors are coming from and realizes that people are running away scared. Our protagonist meets a member of Ake's company named Makita. After a while, our protagonist encounters a giant aratama from the aratama before. Our protagonist tries to use a spell to purify the aratama, but just then Ake's entire security company arrives and starts shooting at the monster, and Shinshi takes the opportunity to get our protagonist away from the fight. The firearms fail to do anything to the aratama, so Ake and Iwara arrive at the scene. There, Ake uses a dark spell that transforms his human arm into that of an aratama. The giant monster tries to attack Ake, but this guy uses his arm to quickly and easily counterattack. Here, Shinshi explains to our protagonist that Ake is absorbing the energy of the aratamas to make it part of him and use it. In the end, Ake kills the monster by ripping out its eye and tells everyone present that one day he will become more powerful than Haruaki, than his master, and more than the fire dragon itself, to then squeeze it and drink the liquid, absorbing the power and ending Ake's transformation. But at nightfall, our protagonist sees how Ake suffers pain from having used the aratama's power. The next day, our protagonist and Shinji go to the third island, where Haruaki lives and trains with his students. This island turns out to be quieter and less developed, as it only has forests and shrines. Shinji complains since he normally only comes to this island during festivals, but this time he came just to accompany our protagonist. So our protagonist says he wants to get to know Haruaki better, and also wants to try to become friends with his students. After a while, two students named Chataro and Shako receive our protagonist and Shinji, and then take them to the shrine dedicated to the dragons of the fourth island. Our protagonist asks what this shrine is about, and the students explain to him that on the fourth island is where the dragons live, and that a long time ago they became enraged, so this shrine was built to pacify them. But they also tell our protagonist about the feat his father accomplished years ago, when he sacrificed himself to calm the fire dragon. Here, our protagonist remembers when Akka said he would become more powerful than the fire dragon. And after thinking about it for a while, he has a vague memory of once meeting a dragon, but he's not very sure of this memory, although we already know why he remembers that. Shinji tries to convince the students to have a beer together, and just then Haruaki arrives. Haruaki takes our protagonist to the temple archives. Haruaki asks our protagonist what the reason for his visit is, and he responds that he met Eike on the first island, but doesn't understand why Akka decided to use such different methods to exorcise the Aratamas. Haruaki changes the subject by asking our protagonist if he knows anything about laic energy. Our protagonist says yes. Haruaki shows our protagonist the 3 islands that were in sight and tells him about a great current of energy, or the laic energy, and then tells our protagonist that he should also be able to feel this current of energy. Our protagonist tries to concentrate to feel the energy, while Haruaki tells him how this energy works and what the laic masters do with it. Our protagonist will connect more and more, and when it seems that he is about to access the main current of laic energy, Haruaki interrupts him, telling him to be careful when doing this as it can be dangerous. There, Haruaki explains to our protagonist that the Atamas are made of the same laic energy, and that they are harmless, but they can turn into Aratamas if the place becomes contaminated. So he tells him again that the work of the laic masters is to purify these beings to return them to the laic energy. Our protagonist asks Haruaki, "Why did Eika eat a rat to become stronger?" And he responds that putting one of those beings into the body means corrupting oneself and becoming an eremitas. The protagonist wonders why Akka would go to that point in order to become more powerful. With the passing of days, Shinji continues training our protagonist in how to control his powers. Apparently, our protagonist knows how to deal with his power, but does not know how to control it. He tries to use his power, but loses concentration for a few seconds and causes an earthquake that can be felt across the 4 islands. There, Shinji tells our protagonist not to be scared by a simple earthquake, and not to lose concentration like that, so he needs to train more. The next day, another earthquake occurs, so Shinji invites our protagonist to the tomb of his master, that is, Makoto, the father of our protagonist. When both arrive at the tomb, Shinji sits down and takes some alcohol. Our protagonist does not understand why he has to pay his respects to his father just because of an earthquake. But then 3 elders appear who also pay their respects to Makoto and explain to our protagonist that these earthquakes surely happened because the fire dragon is in a bad mood. So, he has the custom of visiting the tomb in the hope that Makoto protects the islands from beyond. Our protagonist takes the opportunity and asks what his father did to protect the islands about 10 years ago. So Shinji tells the story of the water and fire dragons, the disappearance of the water dragon, and how Makoto sacrificed his life to seal the fire dragon to prevent the 4 islands from being destroyed. Upon learning this, our protagonist pays his respects to his father, even though he still does not remember him. Shortly after, our protagonist and Shinji see Ivara around, but when they both see her, she simply ignores them. Shinji and our protagonist go to visit Ivara's parents' tomb and realize that she dropped a keychain, So our protagonist decides to return it to her and asks Shinchi to accompany him to return it to her. Both of them go back to the first island and arrive at Eika's house. But he was just about to leave, so Eika tells them both to speak with Makita and warns them to be careful on the way back home, because things can get difficult. Our protagonist is left confused, not understanding Aka's words, so our protagonist and Shinchi sit with Makita. Our protagonist thinks he spoke disrespectfully to Avara at the cemetery, but Makita tells him not to worry, as the people in Aka have the customs of laughing and having fun in the cemetery as a way of paying their respects to the deceased. Although that depends on how the person died, since it could sadden others, as is the case with Avara. Our protagonist asks how Ivara's parents died, and Makita recounts that a few years ago, a fire aratama appeared that attacked Ivara's house, burning it completely until Eika appeared, but it was too late to save Ivara's parents. In the end, our protagonist asks Makita to give Ivara her keys, but Makita tells our protagonist that he should do it himself and calls Ivara, who arrives shortly after. At first, our protagonist and Ivara are a bit shy, but he manages to return her keys to her, and Ivara thanks him. But then another tremor is felt. Makita thinks it's an earthquake, but Shinchi says it's a fire aratama, and Ivara, upon hearing this, runs out, leaving the two boys confused. So, a worried Makita reveals to them that Ivara acts impulsively when there is fire or a rat around. On the other hand, Eika is talking to Sanji about the incident of the giant aratama, and that they need to prepare for the evacuation of the citizens. At one point, Ulka receives a call from Makita warning him about the appearance of the fire aratama. Going back to our protagonist and Shinchi, they both run to where the fire aratama was, and on the way, they see a woman trapped in a burning building. Shinchi stays behind to rescue her, while our protagonist continues looking for Ivara. Speaking of her, Ivara defends two civilians who were being attacked by the monster. She could fight against the aratama using her lightning powers while remembering the death of her parents and the promise that she would never run away again. But at one point, the monster blocked one of Ivara's attacks and was about to burn her. But just then our protagonist arrives and creates a water shield, saving Ivara. Shortly after, Shako and Chataro arrive, so the four of them join forces to defeat the monster. And after an intense and difficult battle, they manage to purify the aratama. But when everything seemed to be going well, suddenly 3 fire rocks fall from the 4th island. These 3 rocks quickly turn into aratamas that immediately attack our protagonist's group. And they manage to take cover from the attack by a little. But when it seems they have no escape, right then Haruaki and Ake appear and defeat the 2 monsters, each in their own way. Eika is about to consume the eye of the Haratama he has just defeated, in order to easily defeat the remaining monster. But Haruaki quickly purifies the eye, causing Ake to overheat. He then scolds Ake that Makoto would be disappointed to see his student using dark powers. But Aka responds that Makoto died because of Haruaki's weakness and wants to avenge him. The aratama tries to attack both men, but Haruaki and Aka defeat it together, leaving the monster's eye on the ground. Aka tries to grab the eye, but Haruaki stops him using his wind powers. This causes Aka to overheat and transform to fight against Haruaki. There, Shinchi arrives and purifies the monster's eye and scolds both men for setting a bad example for their students who were present. So they both recapacitate and apologize to their students. At nightfall, Ivara says goodbye to our protagonist at the train station where Shinchi and Haruaki's other students were. Our protagonist thanks Ivara for working with him to defeat the monster and hopes to work with her again. Upon hearing this, Ivara asks our protagonist for his number to stay in contact, and Haruaki's students take the opportunity for the 4 friends to be happier. So in the end, they all became friends. So, when our protagonist arrives home, he asks Mboko what happened between Ake and Haruaki, so she tells him what little she knows, which is that the day both students found their master dead, Akka never returned to being the same, as he felt that he could not continue living on the islands and reconsidered his future as a laic master. This caused him and Haruaki to fight to the point where they separated, and shortly after, Eika abandoned his master's teachings in order to learn to use dark powers. The next day, our protagonist was taking a nap when he had the same dream he had before arriving at the Sayako Islands. But this time, our protagonist looks into the depths, and what he sees is the fire dragon that has turned into an aratama, and this one tries to reach our protagonist. This makes our protagonist feel like he's drowning, and Shinji wakes him up, only to realize that our protagonist has activated his dragon eyes. Shinji does not say anything about what he saw, and our protagonist receives messages from his friends inviting him to the festival being held on the third island. Our protagonist is happy since it's the first time he can have fun with his friends, so Shinji gives our protagonist a mask that turns out to be Makoto's, as it's customary to wear masks at the festival. On the night of the festival, our protagonist is worried about Shinji. Shinji accompanied our protagonist, and he was impressed by the large number of people at the festival. Later, our protagonist meets up with his friends, and while they were all enjoying the festival, right then the volcano on the fourth island erupts, which means the fire dragon has awakened. The people at the festival realize a disaster is about to occur and start to panic, remembering what happened 10 years ago. So Mayor Sanji calms the situation and tells the citizens to prepare to evacuate the islands before the volcano burns them all. Our protagonist is worried and asks Shinji what he has to do, to which Shinji laughs and asks our protagonist what he thinks about the islands. Our protagonist does not understand how Shinji can laugh at a moment like this and ask nonsensical questions. But our protagonist responds that he likes the islands. Upon hearing this, Shinji activates a teleportation spell to leave, leaving our protagonist alone. The next day, while the citizens evacuate the islands, Haruaki along with his students arrive to speak with our protagonist. He tells him that what is happening already occurred 10 years ago and why it is happening again. He recounts that 15 years ago, when the power of the water dragon diminished, it was Makoto who controlled the situation. He performed a ritual to restore the water dragon's power to balance the laic energy. In the process, he eliminated the dragon from the flow of this energy and transformed its enormous life force into a smaller one. With this, the water dragon could gradually recover its ancient power and thus return to the laic energy when ready. Everyone suspects that our protagonist is the water dragon, so Haruaki asks our protagonist to join his hands to confirm it, and after using a spell, he realizes that our protagonist is the water dragon. But since our protagonist is a very small humantis, he will need to train for several years to regain his true power and bring peace to the islands. Although another option is to perform a new ritual to release him again from the laic energy. Haruaki asks our protagonist to train hard so that he can fulfill his destiny. He then asks his students to go with Momoko and evacuate because he plans to go to the fourth island and sacrifice himself in the same way Makoto did 10 years ago. Haruaki says goodbye and teleports to the fourth island, where he begins to cast a barrier spell but is interrupted by Eke, and they both start arguing about who has to sacrifice themselves so that the other can take care of their students. But this gives the fire dragon time to appear in front of them. The dragon is so powerful that they cannot do anything to it. Akka quickly transforms his arm and attacks the dragon, but the dragon is so powerful that it does nothing to it. For the first time, Haruaki and Eika call a truce and work together to attack the dragon. But this still does not affect the dragon, which does not take long to brutally attack Akka. Haruaki tries to take Akka to a safe place, and just as the dragon was about to kill them both, our protagonist and his friends arrive to cover them from the attack. Both masters scold their students for being in such a dangerous place. But in the end, they all worked together and launched several attacks towards the dragon. But no matter how much they use all their most powerful powers and abilities, no one manages to hurt the dragon. But just then, Shinchi arrives to perform the ritual he has prepared for his whole life. Let's remember Shinchi's ritual. It is the ritual to restore our protagonist's water dragon powers. And Shinchi reveals to everyone that he knows how to use the ritual for our protagonist to become the water dragon again. So quickly, Shinchi uses a spell to teleport his consciousness into our protagonists and our protagonists into the realm of the laic energy. Once there, Shinchi explains to our protagonist that he has to function as a conduit to connect the water dragon's soul with the laic energy, since his water power is quite strong and very compatible with our protagonist. Our protagonist is not very sure, as it seems Shinchi is hesitating. And it's because Shinchi is actually afraid of dying, but is still going to do what is necessary to protect his home. Upon learning this, our protagonist does not want his friend to sacrifice himself. But the green-haired man does not give him a choice and grabs his hand for them both to jump into the lake energy. And then they fall into the water where the water dragon's body can be seen in the background. There, our protagonist regains all his memories and true power, returning to the real world. Shinchi falls to the ground due to instant death, and our protagonist transforms into the water dragon. Everyone present moves away from the area and sees how the fire dragon and the water dragon fight endlessly. But it turns out that this fight is not for either of the dragons to win, but rather to regain harmony. In other words, both dragons generate conflict in order to create harmony. Basically, it's like good and evil are in balance, the yin and the yang. Our protagonist's friends are worried since they don't know if, after achieving harmony, our protagonist will be able to return to them. While this was happening, our protagonist apologizes to the fire dragon for having left him alone for so long. With this, the fire dragon calms down and stops being an aratama, and then both dragons merge and restore the balance of the lake energy. But to everyone's surprise, our protagonist returns from the fight in his human form and tries to wake Shinchi up. But after a while, everyone realizes that he has already passed away. The death of Shinchi, everyone returns to their homes and informs people of everything that happened. Afterwards, Shinchi's funeral is held, and our protagonist is emotionally devastated to the point of locking himself in his room and not wanting to talk to anyone. His friends are also saddened by Shinchi's death, but they are more worried about our protagonist. Momoko visits our protagonist in his room to invite him to see Shinchi one last time. But our protagonist feels guilty because if he had been more powerful, his friend would not have had to sacrifice himself. Momoko hugs our protagonist and tells him it was the only way. But then, our protagonist sees some anamas going to the room where Shinchi was being waked. Our protagonist goes and meets with Sansi, who thanks our protagonist for saving the island, but is equally sad because another family member had to sacrifice himself for the others. Our protagonist bids farewell to Shinchi, and in a moment of anger, our protagonist's consciousness is once again dragged into the realm of the laic energy. There, our protagonist finds Shinchi holding onto a pole to avoid disappearing. Our protagonist does not know how to help Shinchi, and he mocks our protagonist, telling him that if he really calls himself his disciple. Our protagonist responds to the mockery, telling him that he regrets being a bad apprentice, and their Shinchi falls into the currents of the lake energy, and our protagonist returns to the real world. Our protagonist helps Shinchi there. Our protagonist has an idea and asks Momoko to call Haruaki and the others because he believes he can still save Shinchi. Our protagonist runs off and transforms into the water dragon by his own will in the air. Our protagonist imagines the realm of the lake energy and decides to enter it again. And he submerges himself in the volcano of the fourth island. Once our protagonist arrives at the current of lake energy, he starts looking for Shinchi, but right there, our protagonist reunites with his father. They hug a little, and Makoto explains to our protagonist that in the last 10 years, he was containing the fire dragon there until our protagonist could awaken as the water dragon. Makoto also explains to our protagonist that he asked him to leave the island for 10 years to avoid the fire dragon possessing him while he grew up. And he apologizes to our protagonist for having put him through all this. Our protagonist understands his father's reasons and asks for help to find Shinshi. So father and son go to look for Shinshi. While this was happening, our protagonist's friends gather at the dragon's sanctuary because they learned what our protagonist is doing. So Haruaki performs a ritual to find our protagonist in the realm of the Laic energy. Going back to our protagonist, he and Makoto find Shinshi and rescue him. Our protagonist scolds his friend for sacrificing himself, but Shinshi excuses himself by saying it was the only way. But Makoto says there was another way, which is that the people of the island were already prepared to abandon them if the fire dragon got out of control, since in the end, the natural cycle of life is to let the islands burn. Our protagonist proposes to return to the real world, but it turns out that none of the three know how to return. But then, our protagonist sees a light in the distance and takes Shinshi there, thinking it is the exit. Makoto says goodbye to both boys, as he has to stay and keep the fire dragon company. Our protagonist and Shinshi get closer and closer to the exit, thanks to Haruaki helping them. Meanwhile, Aka uses his power to pass his hand into the realm of the Laic energy and grabs our protagonist to help him get out. But at one point, the fire dragon's consciousness tries to prevent our protagonist from leaving with Shinshi. The video ends here. If you enjoyed the video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel.